Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with a couple of cards using some of the newest release from Simon Says Stamps Yay You release. This is the Orange Blossom Stencil and Wafer die set. And this is one of the few times where I genuinely recommend having both. I wouldn't use this stencil on its own. You would have to do so much masking, and I'm way too lazy to do that. But it just, the coordinating wafer dies for this just make this so fabulous. So there's just the stencil, this little 6x6 stencil that's got couple of leaf clusters, and then you've got a couple circles for oranges, and then a little orange blossom, all the stuff. And then there's a coordinating wafer die set that will die cut all of this. So with these leaf clusters, or little branches, whatever, I had die cut just some cardstock with those two coordinating wafer dies, and that just made it so much easier for me to make sure I had the stem lined up properly, so that when I do go to die cut them, everything's done. And then off camera, I actually ended up stenciling on top of those die cuts because I wasn't going to waste them. So you could do either way. You could do it like this, where you're kind of using the open space from those die cuts as a guide, or you could just die cut them and then stencil on top. I just used some of my dot runner, which I'm going to use a little later in the video, to hold those die cuts in place and then stencil on top. It was quick and easy. Yeah, I think next time that's what I would just do. Just run a bunch of other die cuts through, because then I don't have to really do any extra lining up, but it was still not a big deal. So I did that, and I'm using Simon's Pawsitively saturated inks for my blending with some blending brushes. And for the leaves, I was using Sprout and Fairway. And then for the little orange blossoms, because technically orange blossoms are white, even though you could do any color you want, I just sometimes get zero in on this is what it should be. But what I did was I used a really pale and a light hand yellow. So I used Simon's Lemonade ink, and it's very light. More obvious in real life than it is on camera. And then I used CITRINE for the centers of those little flowers. And I did a whole bunch, just in fitting them into random little corners of all the pieces, because I'm going to die cut everything and then create little clusters. So I did all of that. And then I also there was individual leaves in the stencil and wafer die set. So I did a panel of cardstock with those. And then I did this whole panel with the oranges, which I blended Peachy and Grapefruit inks. And then I used Mandarin, which was the darkest, to add the little dots, that give it that orange look and texture. So just went around, filled everything in. And then off camera, I die cut everything. Just kind of sat and zoned out. I was watching a movie, whatever, that sort of a thing. And then just die cut all the pieces. Didn't take very long. And I ended up with this little pile of leaves and oranges and orange blossoms. So I was going to just arrange them on my card, but then I thought it'd be kind of nice to add a little bit extra. So I'm using the Domed Arches stencil set, and I put some dot tape on the back. This is just an A2 piece of cardstock, and I tape that down just to hold the cardstock in place. And I'm working on my waffle flower mini stencil media mat, which I have clinging to my Tonic magnetic mat. They just work so nicely because the magnets will work through the stencil mat. So that's what I'm working with. I'll have links to everything like always. So for the arch, I use the same green ink. So just that Sprout ink and a lighter hand. And then I decided to add more of these leaf clusters just because they'll kind of fill it in the background. And I did Sprout ink again, but with a heavier hand. And I added Field Green, which is the darkest green of this trio. So these leaves are going to be a bit darker than the ones that I stenciled in the beginning that I die cut. So that these will just kind of fill in the background. So no specific pattern. I thought I would just kind of fill in this upper corner with these leaves and went along, and then I'll repeat the process on a second panel because I was like, I've got enough of this stencil and I was enjoying myself. I'm like, I'm going to make 2 cards. So, and I ended up filling in more because, you know, I'm getting ink smears everywhere as always, but it's like, oh, if there's an ink smear, stick a leaf on top of it. Like I always say, add some splatter, stick some bling on it, whatever. Don't let it ruin, you know, everything. Or if it's like at the very beginning, flip the cardstock over. It's why cardstock has 2 sides. So did all of that. And then I did a little bit of stenciling on what will be the insides of these cards. I didn't add as much, but that was the beauty of it. It's like, ooh, I can go in and add, you know, some leaf clusters as well using the same greens. So I use Sprout and Fairway for these greens. So with all of it, I was going in with like my larger brush and the lighter green, and then I would take my smaller blending brush and the slightly darker green and keep that more concentrated towards the like base of all the leaves, and I would use that also for the stem. And then as everything dries, it kind of blends into each other and you've got that bit of variation, which I really like with the stencils. You can do it with stamps, but it's a little more work to get that sort of a variation. So I did all of that, and then I die cut some white cardstock and some glossy white cardstock with the new Yay wafer dies from CZ Design. And the top layer is going to be the glossy cardstock. So I'm going to layer 2 layers with just regular white cardstock, stick those together with some craft tacky glue, and then my top layer will be that white glossy cardstock, which just gives it that little extra something. You know, it gives it that extra shine. You can achieve this by adding glossy accents, but I love having the white glossy cardstock, so then I don't have to mess around with glossy accents and wait for it to dry. I love me some glossy accents for other things, but if I can avoid, again, smearing things where I don't want them. And the biggest one is like waiting for it to dry because I'm impatient. So anyway, those panels I coated the backs of with Simon's Big Mama foam tape. So I've got that bit of dimension, but not a lot of bulk. So put that on the backs of them. And then I'm going to pop these onto my card bases because I wanted these in place before I started adhering all of the leaves and everything, because I knew I was probably going to have pieces that I would want to trim off. So peeled off the backing, stuck those onto my card base, nearly stuck the second one on upside down, although that probably would have turned out okay, but I caught it in time, so turned it around before sticking it down, and then just started fiddling with my placement of all of these. I've got leaf clusters and the oranges and the blossoms and the individual leaves, all the fun things. So once I kind of had a good idea of where I was going with this, I started adhering it all down. You could pop all this up with like foam tape, that sort of a thing, little foam squares. That would give some like fabulous dimension, but because I was doing 2 cards and I had so many little die cuts, I was like, yeah, no. But I like the illusion of dimension that was created by having those stenciled leaves on the card front itself, and then having that bit of dimension from the foam tape on the main panel, and then adhering all these pieces. In the end, it still created its own dimension without me having to, you know, trim 5 million little tiny pieces of foam tape, you know? So I created my little, you know, cluster of leaves and these little orange blossoms and little oranges. And I don't know, the colors, and there's something about, you know, oranges and orange blossoms. I was like, these are so happy. So I got everything adhered, trimmed off whatever was kind of hanging off the card, and I'd purposely kept aside a couple of like the oranges, the leaves, and the orange blossoms because I wanted to add those to the insides of the cards just to finish them off. I'm not going to add any sentiments to the inside, kind of keeping these more open-ended so I can use them for anything. Like these will make great thank you cards or just because cards, thinking of you, you know. So I got everything adhered, and then I put these in my splat box because of course I'm going to add splatter. And also with these, it really gave it that extra little something. So I put them in my splat box, and I'm just using some white gouache. So I squeeze that onto my little plastic palette, and then I'm just going to add a bit of water to thin it down. And I'm using my little fan brush here. And once I've got it mixed up, I'm just going to start tapping that fan brush and adding the white splatter to both of these card fronts. And it's just going to give it that little extra something. So once I've got everything splattered to my liking, cleaned off my brush, cleaned off my palette, set those aside. And I set aside the cards to let that dry. Doesn't take very long, but let them dry. And I'm going to add a little companion sentiment from the Coordinating CZ Design Yay You stamp set. And I have just a little square of white cardstock here in my Misty. I'm going to use my anti-static powder tool. And I'm going to apply that to my cardstock. And then I'm going to ink up this little stamp with clear embossing ink. And just like I've said in recent videos, I try to avoid really pressing hard when stamping like little sentiments like this, small images, anything really detailed. You don't want to mush on it too much because you'll press it deeper into the cardstock and you'll lose the definition, which especially with small, fine little words, you definitely don't want that. So I stamped it with clear embossing ink. I'm coating it with Simon's Detail Clear Embossing Powder, and I'm going to melt that. So of course it's going to look like nothing. I just tilt it in the light to make sure everything is melted, smooth, glossy. Once I've got that, flip it around, do that a second time. And then I'm going to blend on some of these orange inks to coordinate with what I did for the little oranges. So I'm going to use the Peachy and the Grapefruit inks. So I'm just working on a piece of scratch paper here and blending that ink on top of the sentiment. And because the sentiment was clear heat embossed, it resists the ink. So I started with the lighter color, which was the Peachy, and then I'm going in with the Grapefruit and just adding a bit of that just to deepen it up a little bit. And then once I was happy with that, I just took my little cloth and rubbed that on both of these sentiments just to pick up any ink that might be sitting on top of that embossing powder to make sure the sentiment is still legible. And then off camera, I just trim these down with my little guillotine trimmer so that I can adhere these to my card front. So I adhered the little companion sentiments, and then I adhered the die cut sentiments that I had stacked together. And once I've got those adhered into place, as always, like a broken record, you could stop here, but I had to add just a little bit more bling because I was like, I'm sure I've got a color that, of bling that's going to work. And I did. I had these Studio Caudia rose pink pearls that they are a little more pink, but they kind of just went well with these oranges. They kind of just picked up that more peachy tone that these colors ended up drying to, which I was kind of happy with. So even though they're supposed to be oranges, they just, I don't know, that a slightly unexpected, somewhat peachy color was kind of nice. So sprinkled those throughout both of these cards, adhered them into place with my craft tacky glue and my little embellishment wand. And then I'm going to pair these cards with some lemon chiffon envelopes from my stash just to kind of tie it all together. And now you can see that shine from that white glossy cardstock on the die cut sentiments, which just, chef's kiss, love. So I got my little bit of bling, I got some splatter, I've got the, soft blending, which just, you can't fully achieve that with stamping. There's something about being able to stencil things or blending inks that just is so nice. So anyway, that was my cards for today. As always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I'll have a supply list. I'll link to everything I use so you can check it out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I very much appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.